doing here? What kind of meeting did I come to this morning? So I'm having a hard time. Welcome everybody. Welcome those joining us virtually. We are in the Revelation of Jesus Christ. We are in chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 7 through 13. This is the message to the church in Philadelphia. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. I know your works. Look, I have set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but are lying. I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word of patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. You will never go out of it. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. When my youngest daughter Jody started college, she brought home an assignment from her English comp professor who offered her some constructive criticism on her topic sentence, her thesis sentence. He said it was too wordy and she, quote, needed to dumb it down. Well, that didn't sit real well with my daughter. She was appalled that she was in a college and somebody was asking her to dumb down her work. And I said, you know, that's really kind of the neat thing about Twitter. I don't use Twitter, but I know a lot of people who do, and I got where the professor was going. She needed to learn how to say a whole lot in a very short period of time. And I said, that's the really neat thing about Twitter is you have to make your point or have a fully developed thought in 140 characters or less. But the problem is, unless you're a celebrity, nobody really cares what you have to say, right? We tend to place a lot of value on celebrity status. You don't matter much unless you're a big shot. And sadly, having been in ministry quite a while, the same is true among the culture of the church. Nobody pays attention to the small fry. The little church in a small town, or worse, a little church in a big town. Even if that church is faithful to the gospel, what they're doing and what they have to say doesn't seem to matter a whole lot to people. They're not the ones getting awards at conventions, right? They're easily overlooked and ignored, and their ministry oftentimes dismissed by the masses. But the story of the church in Philadelphia is a bit different. This is a church, Jesus said, I know you have very little strength, but he paid attention to everything they ever did. He noticed everything they did. I know your work. He validated and encouraged this struggling but faithful church, and he guaranteed their survival and their future blessings. The church in Philadelphia in the Revelation is unique among the other 6 churches addressed in the Revelation. All but the church in Smyrna and the church in Philadelphia received a strong word of rebuke from Jesus about their activities. In verse number 1, Jesus addressed the church, the angel of the church in Philadelphia, and he used none of the symbols that he had used previously when he talked to the other churches. Those symbols and metaphors that we learn about in the first chapter, verses 12 through 16. In the church in Philadelphia, Jesus simply plainly told them who he was, what he has, and what he does. He is the one who is holy. He's the one who is true. He's the one who has the key of David, and he opens and no man shuts, and he shuts and no man opens. That's what he does. It speaks of his authority and his power. Now, Philadelphia was a city established by King Attalus of Pergamum, and his nickname was Philadelphia, and it means a lover of a brother. Attalus was known for the love that he had for his brother Eumenes, and the city was named in recognition of this love that he had for his brother. And as we look at the rest of the letter here, some of the names that are going to be brought up, you might recall them being mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. This was an important commercial city, but it also experienced several earthquakes, one of which laid the city to ruins. It was ultimately rebuilt by Rome, and it became a strategically and a commercially important city. About 50 years prior to the Revelation being written, the city experienced a massive earthquake, and it destroyed much of the city. Now, some of the smaller, poor homes could have survived, but if you could imagine those tall public buildings with their marble and the pillars and all of these things shaking and coming down, you can imagine how devastating and dangerous and damaging that could be. Just like the church in Sardis, the language that Jesus used with the church in Philadelphia, once again, it runs parallel with the history of the city in which they were situated. In verse number 7, according to an ancient document known as the Apostolic Successions, Demetrius was the angel of the church in Philadelphia. He was their pastor. You can read about Demetrius very briefly, I might add, in John's 3rd epistle. He's mentioned along with Gaius. He was the recipient of that particular epistle. We don't know a whole lot about Demetrius. We know that John commended him. He may have been someone that Gaius had heard about. John vouched for his character. What we see here, however, is that the church was thriving under Demetrius's leadership, even though they were small, and they had very little strength, and they were suffering in that town. He addressed this church as the one who's holy and true. He has the key of David. He opens a door and no one shuts it, and he shuts a door and no one opens. I love how he pays attention to every little detail of this small church. I would find it encouraging. He says, I know you have very little strength. Perhaps they were just small in number. They may have been greatly outnumbered by those who attended the synagogue in town. The commentator N.T. Wright, Greek scholar, he says, just as in Smyrna we have an indication that the synagogue community may have been using its civic status to block the advance of the message of the gospel. A very Jewish message nonetheless, but one that was really challenging to Jewish people. And so you should imagine here when Jesus is talking about the synagogue of Satan, a Jewish community of several thousand with its own buildings and its own community life, situated against a church of maybe 2 or 3 dozen people, holding on to the highly improbable chance and risky claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. They were a really small church, but they were faithful. And this ought to encourage everyone to realize that Jesus pays attention to his church regardless of her size and regardless of the impact that they are or are not making in the community. There's no indication that they were really making a big advance in Philadelphia at the time. They were small, they were weak, they didn't have any power. They were being shut down at every turn by this synagogue of Satan who used their status to block the advance of the gospel. Faithfulness when it's tempting to be unfaithful. Faithfulness in the presence of a world of unfaithfulness, that's what catches the eye of Jesus here. He noticed a lot about this church in Philadelphia. He said, you have kept my word, you have not denied my name. Now, in our society, the opposite is true sometimes. We tend to think that bigger is always better, or at least it's more effective. If you're small and you're unknown, you're easily ignored, right? We pay attention and we celebrate the massive church buildings and the charismatic pastors and the large crowds and the personalities and the money that's just flowing in and out of the various projects that are undertaking. That catches our eyes. Nobody invites a small church pastor to come and speak at a large conference, right? What contribution could they possibly make to a larger group of people that are gathered? Their life and their ministry is typically dismissed. Yeah, they might get an occasional platitude to make them feel better about serving the Lord in a small capacity, but not a whole lot of value in our culture, in our society. Even amongst churches, is they're placed on the ministry of what seems to be insignificant. That's the attitude of the world. But Jesus says, I know your works. I know you have very little strength, but you've not denied my name and you've kept my word. You've been faithful. This is true the way a lot of people assess things in our society, but it's not the way Jesus assesses his church. Reminds me of the story of Samuel the prophet in 1 Samuel chapter 16, where the Lord spoke to Samuel and says, don't have any regard for his appearance or stature, because I have not selected him. God does not look at things like humans do. Humans only see what's visible to the eye, but God sees right into the heart. And it's likely, given the size of this church, that the impact that they were making was very minimal, negligible. But what this little snippet tells us is of a church that was faithful. A church that was faithful, but they didn't grow as a result of their faithfulness. Isn't that something? You do all the right things and not a single other person may ever come in the door. They may have been hindered on their mission. This massive synagogue, this large community of people using their influence in society to shut down at every stop their advancement of the gospel. It's not, to understand the significance here, Jesus says, I'm the one that has the key of David. You've got to go back to the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 22, we read the story of the oracle concerning the Valley of Vision. This valley was located near Jerusalem. And in the oracle, we read that Jerusalem was full of a lot of commotion. The leaders fled. They were subsequently captured without any kind of resistance. In Isaiah chapter 22 and verse number 19, or verse number 9, the city of David had a lot of breaches in its defense. The city of David was vulnerable and exposed. They tried to strengthen and fortify the city, but they never looked to the Lord. Isaiah 22, verse 10 through 11. God called them to weep and wail, but instead they celebrated with feasting and joy and revelry. They partied today because they were certain they were going to die tomorrow. At this time, God addressed them as the steward of the city, a person named Shebna. Shebna was quite possibly an Egyptian, and without permission, he took charge of the palace and he cut out a grave for himself. He lusted for the tomb fit for a king, but the Lord would take hold of Shebna and hurl him away from any honorable burial. God would roll him up like a ball and toss him into the large countryside. Shebna would simply become as insignificant as a speck of dust in the universe. He'd be stripped of all of his status and privileges. All the authority of Shebna would be handed over to Eliakim, the servant of the Lord. In Isaiah 22:22, that's where we read that statement about the key of David. Eliakim would be the one who would receive the key to the house of David. And what he opens, no one will shut. And what he shuts, no one will open. All of that language in Isaiah referred to God coming in judgment and turning things around and removing Shebna, a steward who was not worthy of the office, and then putting someone else in place who was. This key of David represents identity and authority. It is a claim that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. Further, the one with the key has the authority to open and shut things, right? The one with the key has the authority to grant admission or deny entry. Here in Revelation 3, verse 7 through 13, Jesus identifies himself as the one who has the key of David. He exercises his regal authority and power. He opens a door for this little church to walk through that could not be shut by any adversary. This is a story of a faithful but weak church, where God reveals his power in a way that's fitting for their weakness. God's power is enough for a weak church. They don't need anything else. They don't need a big dog and pony show every week. They don't need smoke and lights. They don't need a fancy praise band. They don't need all of these events. They need God's power. That's what a church needs, is the power of the Holy Ghost. They don't need charismatic personalities. They need the power and the authority of the Lord Jesus Christ. And nobody can stop a church out of the move under the authority of Jesus. The gates of hell, Jesus said, will not prevail against his church. He's opened a door and he's given them permission to move forward with the gospel. That's all they needed, right? They might be small, they might be weak, they may be hindered, but they are backed up by Jesus. They've been validated, they're encouraged, they're acknowledged by the Lord of the universe to go out and keep moving forward. He says in verse 10 and 12 that they kept the word of his patience and they endured steadfastly. Though they were small and had a little strength, they would now go out with permission to go where they had been previously hindered in silence. They can go forward with the word that they've been faithful to. And he tells them in verse number 11 to hold fast to what you have, that no man will take your crown. Crown was a symbol of honor. The idea here is that they were not to forfeit their honor by giving in to the temptation to forsake consistency for a life of compromise and ease. I have a friend that she was a physique competitor. I mean, she trained her body and got on stage and posed and flexed and competed against other people. And it wasn't that she did anything special, it was that she was consistent day in and day out with her food intake and with her training. Consistency. She preferred that over a life of compromise and ease, and she kept cleaning up. Every time she'd compete, she'd get first place. Consistency. Jesus concluded in verse 12 with a promise to them that if the weakened church overcame the urge to just give up and opt for a life of ease, he said, if you don't give up here, I'm going to make you a pillar in the temple of my God. I'm going to write upon you a new name, my name, the name of the city of my God, which is the New Jerusalem. There's a theme that has been consistent here. I don't know if you've noticed this, but let me land the plane with a couple of final thoughts here about Philadelphia. I don't know about you, but I found this message encouraging today. With each address to each church so far in the Revelation, this is what Jesus wants from his people. In Ephesus, he wanted them to be faithful to their first love. You remember that? In Smyrna, he invited them to be faithful unto death. In Pergamos, he wanted them to be faithful when they were being persecuted by society. In Thyatira, he wanted faithfulness when they were seduced and deceived by false teaching, that they could trust God with their life and future. In Sardis, he wanted faithfulness in being a practicing Christian and not a nominal one. In Philadelphia, he wanted them to remain faithful even when they were weak and had very little strength and power and being constantly hindered on every side. So it begs the question, we understand what Jesus wants from his people. How might God be inviting each of you to a life of faithfulness and consistency?